Hello, I'm back. This is a part 2 to my last video where I talked about all the books that just didn't really work for me this year. It's a very nice way of saying I hated those books. But today I'm going to talk about all of my favorite books of 2024. Like with the last video, this list isn't ranked in any way, it's just in the order that I read them. So let's just get right into it. The first book I want to talk about, it's actually a novella, it's really short, it's around 100 pages, and that's The Salt Grows Heavy by Cassandra Khaw. This isn't my first time talking about this book, but I found this book while scrolling through Goodreads back when I was trying to find more Asian authors in honor of AAPI Heritage Month, and this book is basically a horror retelling of The Little Mermaid with elements of Frankenstein, and also I would personally argue that there's a little bit of Lord of the Flies in it, in the sense that there's a bunch of freaky little children running around unsupervised. And something that's really interesting about this book is that the prologue of the story actually comes at the very end, and I saw someone say that that's because the prologue used to be its own short story that the author then expanded into what is now the book. I don't really know if that's true, but I don't know, I personally believe it because the writing of the prologue feels a little different than the writing of the actual story. And in terms of the actual story, I loved it. I actually just finished rereading it, and I was originally gonna wait until 2025 to reread it, but then I realized I have free will. I can reread it this year and next year. Who's gonna stop me? Despite how gory the book gets, it's still somehow so pretty, and there are so many beautiful quotes throughout the entire book, especially when it comes to the romance between the mermaid and the plague doctor. This book isn't a romance, by the way, but the epilogue, oh, it was so beautiful, and I cried so much reading it. But all of this being said, I do have to make a bit of a disclaimer about this book. The author really loves their thesaurus. Like, almost every other sentence, they throw in a really fat word, and I don't really consider myself to have an eensy-weensy vocabulary. I guess maybe not if I'm using the words eensy-weensy to describe something, but the point is, I consider myself to have an appropriately sized vocabulary, and I did initially find the prose to be a little bit off-putting. Like my first time reading this book, I did find that the author's choice of words disrupted the flow just a little bit because I had to take the time to look up the definitions of every single word I didn't know, and there were a lot of words I did not know. I primarily read on my Kindle, so it's a lot easier to look up words because all you have to do is just beep, hold on a word, and the definition pops up. But it still takes you out of the story a bit, you know? So if you're reading this book for the first time, I would personally recommend that you try to resist the urge to use the dictionary. That's what I did during my reread of this book, and I personally felt like that helped a lot with getting me more immersed into the book, and also I feel like I got more out of the reading experience that way. So yeah, don't put too much pressure on yourself to know what every single word means, unless your vocabulary is like gigantic. Overall though, I don't know if I can express just how much I loved this book. When I read it for the first time, I really liked the story a lot, and I figured that this book would be pretty up there for one of my favorite books of the year, but rereading it really solidified this book as one of my favorites of all time. I know that this is very bold of me to say, but I think it's true. I'm personally willing to commit to this statement. The second book on my list is The Book of Doors by Gareth Brown. This book is about a world where there's a bunch of magical books, and there's this evil woman who's trying to collect all of these magical books. And you follow this woman, I think her name was Cassie, and she works at a bookstore, and she ends up teaming with this man who owns a library of a bunch of these magical books, and they're basically trying to stop the woman from getting access to his books. I found this book to be so charming. Like, the adventure was fun and the plot had pretty high stakes, but it was still somehow so cozy and atmospheric. I think it's because it's a book about books, but I was very pleasantly surprised because I normally don't gravitate towards cozy fantasies or cozy mysteries, or really anything with the word cozy in front of it. I feel like they tend to have lower stakes, and I like my stakes to be very high. Like, give me characters that are absolutely just going through it. Like, oh, that is my bread and butter. I think this book struck a really good balance between plot and vibes. Like, the characters are trying to save the world, but like, aesthetically. Next on this list is actually a series, and it's also a manga, and that's Tokyo Ghoul by Sui Ishida. I think that's how you pronounce their name. It's a very popular series, and I know there's also an anime, but I don't know if people like the anime very much. But if you've never heard of it, it basically takes place in a world where there are humans and there are ghouls, and the ghouls pretty much look and act like humans, but they can only eat humans. And we follow this guy named Kaneki who ends up getting in an accident, and he needs an organ transplant, and I guess the only organs lying around found was a ghoul's organ, so the doctors put that in, so he ends up becoming part ghoul. And the series is basically about ghoul politics and how they interact with humans, but also with each other. I actually read the first few volumes a while back, and I meant to continue the series, but I never did. And I don't know what made me want to get back into this universe recently. I think I saw something that reminded me of Kaneki's Ghoul Mask, and I was like, oh yeah, Tokyo Ghoul. But I'm very glad I did. I think there are 14 volumes in the main series, and there are a few spin-offs. And I read the first 4 volumes back in November. I don't really read mangas or graphic novels often because I personally find graphics to be overstimulating and I get overwhelmed easily, but I'm really enjoying it so far. Like, I'm not a manga connoisseur, but I think the art is really cool, and I really like how politics heavy the series is. The next book I want to talk about is Wisteria by Adeline Grace, and it's the 3rd book in the Belladonna trilogy. The series is basically about this girl who can see death, and all of her guardians just keep dying around her, which makes people very suspicious. Rightfully so. So she's sent to live with her uncle that she doesn't really know, and it turns out that his wife recently died, and now his daughter is also dying, and they're basically just trying to figure out what's going on. Like, why are these people all dying? So that's the general gist of the series. I literally only read this trilogy because I wanted to get to the couple in the last book, because if there's one thing about me, it's that I love a messy fictional blonde. Do I like blondes in real life? No. But something about blondes that only exist in books just does it for me every time. I think it's because I'm tired of like the dark brooding angsty boy. I sped through the first 2 books where the love interest was Death because he is precisely the dark brooding angsty boy that I do not like. But Wisteria follows a character whose perspective we start getting a bit more of in book 2, and instead of Death being the love interest, it's Fate. The reason I like this series so much is because, in my opinion, this is a fantasy romance done well. Like, I don't like it when people try making a fantasy romance anything more than a romance with a fantasy backdrop. Like, it's not that deep, but I feel like people try making it deep. I'm like, no. But this series doesn't do that. It's the same reason why I like the Caraval universe by Stephanie Garber so much. I like that series also doesn't take itself too seriously. And again, it's not trying to be anything more than a romance in a fantasy setting. That's what I wanted, and that's what I got with Wisteria, and also just the entire trilogy. I will say that I wasn't the biggest fan of the ending in Wisteria. Even with the epilogue, I was like, yeah. I wish it ended a little differently, but overall I really liked the book, and I also really liked the main couple, and I think that the author is coming out with another book in this universe in 2025, so I'm very excited for that. And finally, the last book I want to talk about is The Mask of Mirrors by M.A. Carrick. It's the first book in the Rick and Rose trilogy, and there's so many moving parts in the series, but you mainly follow 3 characters. The first is a girl named Ren, and she used to be part of a street gang, but she's now trying to con her way into one of the noble houses so that she can provide for her and her younger sister, and she's specifically targeting House Trimentis, which recently had a fall from grace and now they're really broke. The second character you follow is Gray, and he's a captain in the Vigil, which is basically like law enforcement in this world, and he's mainly trying to find out who killed his brother. There's also this issue of kids not being able to sleep and they end up like dying from it, so make sure to get your 8 hours of sleep. And the third character is a guy named Vargo, and he's a crime boss. He controls like the drug trade among other things, but he's now trying to get into legitimate business. I haven't gotten to the rest of the series yet, but I'm already convinced that this series is gonna be one of my favorites because 1, it's very queer, like that's so fun, but 2, I learned this year that in terms of fantasy, I don't really like books that are about magical creatures. Like, I don't really care about fairies or goblins or dragons, except for that one How to Train Your Dragon series from when I was like 9. They're so good. But yeah, I really like fantasy books that are heavier on the politics, specifically where there's a lot of political infighting, whether that's between different noble houses or clans like in the Greenbone Saga, or different gangs, because I just think the scheming behind everything is just so fun. Bonus points if there's a found family, and extra bonus points if that found family is with people on the outskirts of society. And I'm pretty sure that's gonna be the case with the Rick and Rose trilogy. Fingers crossed. Just as a heads up, if you're interested in this series, the author throws you into the deep end from the very beginning. Like, they introduce a bunch of new terminology and names all at once. So the first few chapters are definitely a little bit intimidating, but I feel like if you just let everything wash over you, it gets better, because as you keep reading, I feel like the authors do a really good job at keeping track of what's new and what's not, and they repeat a lot of the world building terminology, so you definitely get more familiar with everything as you keep reading. Like, by the time I finish the first book, I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of how the world is run and like the different noble houses and the different characters. So yeah, even if you're intimidated from the beginning, I promise it gets better. But yeah, overall I thought The Mask of Mirrors was so fun, and I'm really excited to finish the rest of the series. All of the books are huge, they're like 600-700 pages each, but I think I'll definitely finish the series by at least the end of January, hopefully, knock on wood. So those are my favorite books of 2024. I hope this was a lot more positive than the last video. Obviously, I recommend all of these books I talked about, and if you do end up reading these books, I hope you enjoyed them because I really love these books. And yeah, that's all I have for this video. Thank you so much for watching.